So you talk about this cautious approach. I mean, it seems to be not very cautious when it comes to people who are, as one of your colleagues, John Whittingdale, the media minister, said yesterday, important people, not ordinary Brits who pay their taxes and go out to work. Not even, the nurses and doctors have had a time looking after COVID patients on COVID wards all this last year, or teachers trying to do the Zoom lessons, or the people working in the supermarkets. None of them are important people because they're neither members of the G7 nor are they people who are sponsoring a match at the Euro 2020 Championships. How does the government work out who's important enough to not be cautious when it comes to COVID? And how does it work out who is important enough?
Well, look, the first thing to say is we've learnt a lot over the last year or so about which jobs are important. And it is those key workers, including people working in the food supply chain, people working in supermarkets. These are the jobs that we needed most during those lockdowns, during the early stages of this pandemic. And of course, those working in the NHS and everything as well. So, of course, those are the important roles, those key workers. We've all celebrated that. When it comes to the sporting events and events like G7, what we have done in some of these areas where you have very low numbers of people, but
low numbers.
Yeah, well,
we had. I mean, there were. I think easily more than 1,000 arrived for the G7 summit. UEFA, we're looking at a minimum of 3,000. Pretty much, if you look at the regulations, pretty much anyone who works at any executive level for any company sponsoring this can come into the country under these regulations.
Well, but sport has been heavily disrupted over the last year.
I'm sorry. Let me get my violin. Oh, poor little sport being disrupted.
I think people want to see sport resume, and what we are trying to do is to facilitate these major events where we're able to. We want to try to get back to life as normal. Of course we do. Julia, you and I have had this discussion many times. We want to be able to get back, to be able to support people to travel again. Nobody likes the draconian restrictions we've got in place. And in some of these sporting events, we think we can facilitate them by allowing some people in under different conditions. So there will be very intensive testing, lateral flow testing and so on to make sure...
No, everyone else has to do that anyway. No, I'm sorry. Sport has been disrupted, and there was a decision to basically keep us all happy by making sure that we had a Premier League that came back on. Euro's happening. Brilliant that a lot of these matches are happening here, happening at Wembley, happening the semi-finals and the finals as well. But the reality is, sport can still continue. Millions upon millions of people can enjoy watching those matches with or without some sponsor from Coca-Cola and his mistress hanging out at Wembley in corporate hospitality. And yet you are allowing that to happen. Now, we either have travel quarantine rules because they are vital for keeping us all safe. I would disagree with that from a number of the countries where it is the case. But we either have those rules because they have to keep us safe, you say cautious, or we don't. If we have them, the law must apply to everyone, and certainly an exception. I mean, if you're going to make an exception for Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron, that is perhaps one thing that people would understand for a summit. It's quite another thing when you're talking about UEFA officials and sponsors. It's quite another thing, isn't it?
Well, look, we're trying to get on every front people back to life as normal. And as we've, taken, removed some of the restrictions over the last couple of months, we've allowed shops, first of all, to reopen. Then we allowed pubs to open outside. Now we're allowing pubs to open inside. We want everybody to be able to get back to trying to live life as normal. As I say, on some of these big sporting events, I think people want them to go ahead. We've been trying to find ways to facilitate them. While we're taking an overall cautious approach, the trajectory here on every front, Julia, is to try to start moving.
Okay.
Like we can back
Here's the thing. Why don't we allow parents to attend their children's school sports days? That would mean a lot more to a lot of people than UEFA officials and sponsors being allowed to come to the country. The reality is the government has caved into bullying by UEFA that's basically said, we'll take the matches away. You've done a focus group in number 10, basically saying, do we think people will be more or less happy about this? And I think you may well have got the wrong call. I mean, we either have these rules for everyone or we have these rules for no one. I have been double jabbed. I've had COVID. Millions of people in the same situation. People can take a test, and yet we are not allowed to travel abroad and come back without 10 days of isolation and huge costs of testing. That is simply not fair. And if we are talking about how we run a democratic country, it is simply untenable for there to be people allowed to be above the law. Surely you're a conservative. Is not the rule of law and fairness, is that not fundamental to the principles behind your politics?
Yes, of course it is.
So you know this is wrong then?
Well, no.
You know this is wrong, George.
Of course it is, but
of course it's wrong, yeah?
If there's a particular alternative provision for a particular event, well, then that's different. But I think the wider point, Julia, is I'm a great believer in liberty and in individual liberty. And therefore, obviously we need to get rid of all of these restrictions as quickly as we're able to. Nobody wants to be maintaining the sorts of draconian restrictions we've got in place.
Well, hospitalisations are going down right now, not up. So why are we still maintaining them at all?
Well, the reason we paused them until the 19th of July, as you know, is that the judgment was that we needed to get a higher proportion of the population to have their second jab. Now, we're making good progress. Over 80% now have had one jab, 60% have had the second jab. But while it's absolutely the case that the correlation between hospitalisation and infection on the new Delta variant that first was discovered in India is much, much weaker. It hasn't been entirely severed. So that's why we wanted to try to get more people having the second jab before we
But people could have carried on being jabbed. And by the way, the jabbing rate has gone down rather than up at a time when apparently we're in that race against the jab. I'll leave that side of things there first, but I think this is untenable. I think this is such a two fingers up, frankly, to the British people and what they've gone through for the last year, to put rich sponsors and UEFA officials above the needs of people to go about their daily lives, and to the fact that people aren't even allowed to attend their children's school events when these people are allowed to come into the country and not obey the same rules the rest of us. I think, frankly, is appalling. And I think it's a stain. I think it's a stain upon this government, and I think it's one of the most hypocritical and outrageous things the government has done after a very bad year, frankly, of the government.
5 years on, I mean, the world hasn't fallen apart yet, although we've had a pandemic which made it feel like that from time to time, but not because of Brexit. Afternoon to you.
Afternoon. Well, that's they should put that on the bus, shouldn't they? 5 years ago, the world won't fall apart. That was never the purpose of Brexit. The purpose of Brexit wasn't to try and smash everything up and try and rebuild it as best we can. It was supposed to make things better, not to sort of manage the decline as things were getting worse. And I just have to pick up Andrew on the point about civil servants being traitors. That is an unconscionable remark. There are no traitors in this debate. Everyone wants what's best for Britain. And I am so sick and tired of hearing the word traitor being bandied around like we're in the middle of a bad Second World War film. Talk about people who have different opinions from us. I would never call a Brexiter a traitor. And I expect the same courtesy to Remainers as well. And I also think it's very important, if we're going to blame people for Brexit, maybe it's rather than just casting the blame on civil servants, why don't you actually look inwards for once and say that these problems were both foreseeable and foreseen? And we know that because people like me were writing about them week in, week out for years, to which people like you were saying that we were lying or that we were traitors again, or that we were simply wrong. We were not wrong, we were right. The problems of Northern Ireland were predicted over and over again, and we were simply dismissed. It's about time there was some humility and the people were taking some responsibility for those failures rather than just passing the buck.
Andrew.
No, it's not a question. I mean, let's get it right. I mean, you've had to actually go to the European Parliament to actually see how not undemocratic, but anti-democratic the process was. It was meant to be a parliament, but it was a parliament only in name. It wasn't democratic. It was controlled by the European Commission. And for whatever you think, the rights and wrongs, and we respect other people's views, we have regained our democracy, which was so important. And, we do have the ability to make our own way in life. And, the vaccines was a very good example of how one of the benefits of the Brexit.
Would you acknowledge, Jonathan, that clearly the whole EU club, if we can look at it like that, was there for a purpose. So if you come out of the club, then you do have a different newfound autonomy. I mean, that would be right, yeah? Even if you don't agree with what's yet happened or has happened or where it's going. But there's clearly a new position for the UK to be outside of something.
Well, I mean, we don't live in the 19th century anymore. We live in a world of interconnections, of kind of global organizations, of mutual agreements and pooled sovereignty and shared responsibilities. I mean, the only true the only truly sovereign country in the world is North Korea. So with all these things, it's about where you draw the line. It's about trade-offs. Obviously, we had no one we would say that France or Germany didn't have their sovereignty. It's a ludicrous proposition. What those countries decided, what the UK decided, was in its interest for almost 50 years. It was to share sovereignty on some issues and obviously help to shape those rules, which would be of mutual advantage for everyone, but also retain overall sovereignty in everything. We were always sovereign. That we had the sovereignty to enter the EU and to leave it. The idea that we weren't sovereign, we were some kind of colony, is ludicrous.
Andrew, you wanted to come in on that?
Well, actual fact, if you only have to look at the amount of legislation that was being brought into the UK, the vast amount came via Brussels. So I'm afraid that's factually incorrect.
It's not factually incorrect, is it? I mean, we shaped all those laws.
But let me make my point without it, please. The point is, what value do you put on democracy? I mean, whether you like it or not, we did go to war to fight for our freedoms. We have regained our sovereignty in the vast amount, and I think we should acknowledge that.
But we did have sovereignty, though, Andrew, didn't we? Right? I mean, is it not a little ironic that this impotent Parliament was the very Parliament that then debated the very things we were told that the Parliament wasn't able to debate because they had no sovereignty?
I mean, the problem with our Parliament, they failed to respect the referendum result and did its utmost to frustrate it, and that's what caused the unbelievable anger with so many in the UK, and rightly so. But we are in a
But it was decided. My point is, it was decided at parliamentary level. So, I mean, demonstrably, we had that power, which many people were sort of led to believe we didn't have any of that power. It was all deferred to Brussels, and there was nothing that we could ever do about it. And yet, in the end, it was there and highly visible for all to see that actually the power we had was the very power that was utilised in those many dark nights of debate and negotiation.
Yeah, right. But remember, we entered the EU, many people believe we entered the EU as a free trade association, not for political control over us as such, which that subsequently became. And the British people, rightly I believe, voted to regain that sovereignty. And it's all well and good for people to criticise the referendum result by people saying, well, you didn't know what you were voting for. I believe the British public have a lot more.
And Jonathan, I mean, is one of the issues, do you think, and perhaps where your argument does weaken, is that it's not just for many people, Brexit wasn't just about what was going on now, it was the direction of travel. There was that very real sense that we were moving into a kind of harmonised defence system. Perhaps our legal system would become even more from one hymn sheet, that there would be a unified police service that lurked, and this whole thing would have, I mean, this was an institution that had a parliament, it had a flag, a currency, a president, and an anthem. This was a country.
Well, that clearly wasn't a country. It had there was a European Parliament, to which is actually a lot more democratic than our Parliament in many ways. There are people every single thing has to be. I worked in the Parliament before Andrew was there, and everything, every single amendment that is brought has to be debated. Unlike here, where the Speaker gets to throw them out. All kinds of reasons. It's actually more democratic than our Parliament. But leaving that aside, the idea of a European army is simply not true. By the way,
come on,
that was just there were all kinds of lies.
Jonathan,
there were all kinds of lies.
Please.
Listen, I let you make your point.
We'll bring you in a second, Andrew. Fire away, Jonathan.
So, look, all of these things, even if an EU army was going to happen, and it's not, and I studied this issue in great detail, I wrote 2 reports on it, it simply was not going to, there was never any question of British soldiers being called onto the battlefield by some kind of EU command without the say of the British government. And that's really the point, that the British Parliament and government had overall oversight of everything, because there was no way that any of those changes, even though those changes are actually just myths, if there was some kind of mythical future EU Commission that wanted to enact those changes, the UK would always have a veto over them. And the UK really means the UK people. So if the UK people supported those, then obviously any of those things could happen via the UK government. And if the UK people didn't via the UK government, then they wouldn't happen. Okay. So it was just pure scaremongering.
And well, we don't know what was going to happen in the future, I suppose. But Andrew,
that's the point. The UK would always have had a veto over those changes.
Yeah.
Well, assuming the veto is as valid as we were told it was. I mean, Mr. Cameron will perhaps...
those are enshrined in law. It's not a matter of political opinion.
I think Mr. Cameron talked about the veto not always being worth the paper it was written on.
The veto was
okay.
for
all right.
massive changes.
And Andrew, you wanted to come back in on something.
Let's have the reality of the situation. As an MEP, you saying the European Parliament was more democratic than our Parliament is absolute trife. The reality was, MEPs, you couldn't invoke legislation, you couldn't revoke legislation. You rubber stamp really what the European Commission pushed down your throat. You couldn't really elect your own leader of the Parliament. So it's
MEPs have more power than MPs to vote down trade deals.
It's absolute facade. It's great for the little civil servants who lived out there. You had a lovely little gravy train. It's a civil servant's paradise. But in actual fact, in reality, it was totally anti-democratic. And as for Brussels, as for Strasbourg, just look at it. What it cost? Billions to build, used 4 days a month?
What a ludicrous straw man argument. The MEPs themselves, what you're arguing for is more power for the European Parliament. The European Parliament wanted to suspend the Strasbourg Parliament, and it was a government that you talk about sovereignty that stopped it. It was the French and the Luxembourg government that stopped that.
We are short on the clock, short on time. Just give us a final word each then. Andrew Kerr, English firstly. Over the next 5 years, how do you see the United Kingdom's place in terms of that relationship with the EU and our position in the world?
I think it will always be somewhat troubled, and there will always be this constant arguments going forward, because they know full well that if the UK does well, others will follow and the EU will collapse.
Jonathan, same question to you, sir.
Well, I think that in the next 5 years are going to be, just as divided as the last 5, because the Brexiters have smashed everything up and refused to take responsibility. We warned about the problems in Northern Ireland. We warned about the problems of labour shortages, food shortages, etc. We're simply dismissed, and now we're actually going to see those come to fruition, and no one is taking responsibility.
But a lot of people now really rather concerned about the fact that there does seem to be one rule for one rule for others. G7 summit, leaders, diplomats, media are allowed to come to this country without having to obey quarantine, self-isolation rules. And now we're told that 3,000, maybe even more UEFA officials, sponsors, hangers-on are all going to be allowed to come to this country for a week or more and not face quarantine, not face self-isolation, when millions of us aren't able to travel on holiday or business or to see family members we've not seen for a year or two without having quarantine. Why is it that people involved in football or sponsors of football match should not have to obey the laws that the rest of us obey?
Well, we have been in a process of gradual relaxation, and we've had a succession of events where we've tested the extent to which we're able to lift restrictions. So last night, for instance, at Wembley, we allowed 20,000 people to attend. They had to demonstrate that they'd had double vaccination or that they had a negative test. We've now decided that on the basis of the evidence we've acquired so far, it's safe to move to a further relaxation. So at the time of the semi-finals, that capacity will go up to 60,000. Now, we've been talking to UEFA. Of course, we've had to relax the restrictions for teams in order to come to this country and compete in the first place. UEFA are very keen to allow more of the people attached to the country's teams who do make it through into the semi-finals. We haven't reached a final agreement about the numbers, but we are keen to hold these competitions in the UK. I think there will be very widespread support for the idea that the semi-finals and final should take place in the UK, and hopefully that at least one, if not two, of our home nations will be featuring in them.
Well, but it's quite absurd, is it not, that UEFA basically said, if we don't allow these people to come in, the hangers-on, the people who pay for everything and the officials, then they'll simply take the semi-finals and the final away from us and move them to Budapest. The Italian Prime Minister has got in, Draghi, to say, you can come here and we won't impose any of those problems on you. Basically, money talks. If you're rich and powerful and you can make a threat, the British government will happily open us up to apparently this terrible risk of COVID, which any other 3,000 people coming into the country would bring, which is why they'd have to quarantine. Either there's a risk of people coming into the country from amber list countries without quarantine, or there isn't. But why is there only a risk for me coming in, but not for someone who's a sponsor of UEFA?
Well, first to say they're not coming in order to be able to do whatever they like and travel wherever they
Really?
want.
They're going to be sitting in a travel lodge in Wembley the entire time, apart from when they're not football match. Really?
They will be staying in a agreed designated place, and then they'll be travelling to a match, and then having attended the match, they'll be going back again.
They're not going to go to any restaurants or bars, and there's going to be a police cordon stopping them do so. Really?
No, the agreement we reach, we're keen still to be able to host these tournaments, but we're not going to do anything which puts public safety at risk. So we are absolutely proceeding in line with the advice we receive from Public Health England, from SAGE, and at every stage we will only agree to relaxations if the advice is it is safe. So I took part in discussions earlier on when we were talking about whether or not there should be special dispensation for teams to either come to the UK or indeed for the UK teams to travel abroad to compete, and we were advised that the risk was very small and that therefore it was safe to do so. And as I say, at every stage we have consulted, but it isn't just that we are in discussion with the UEFA about allowing more people to come to attend those matches. We've also agreed that there should be a significant increase in the number of UK spectators.
But you say, look, my thing is, I don't believe there is a risk if people are coming from amber countries and they're testing. That seems to me to be what we need to do. But we've got a 1 in 200 people coming in this country who are being tested and found positive. Now, that is higher than the rate overall in the country, but virtually all of those are from a handful of countries which are on red list and others. 150 countries, people travelling from those countries on the amber list have come in, and people from those countries have not recorded a single positive test. The point is, we don't need these restrictions at all on ordinary people, and the only reason they're being relaxed on these VIPs is because they're very rich and very wealthy and very powerful. Do you not think that sends a message? If you've got money, you can do whatever you bloody well want in this country, and if you haven't, you can't. You have to live under the laws that the government imposes. What message do you think that sends out to us?
Well, the two things I would say is, first of all, that we have only agreed to allow people to come in on the basis that the expert advice is that it is safe to do so.
How? I'm so sorry to interrupt, sir. Why on earth would the expert advice say it was safe for 3,000 UEFA officials to come in, but not for 3,000 other people to come in?
Well, I mean, that we haven't
That's a nonsense,
agreed that particular figure. We are in discussion with UEFA about the numbers that they would like, and we will only agree to allow more people in if we are advised that it is safe. But at every stage, I mean, the semi-finals and the finals are the next stage of our programme of test events. At every stage, we have looked very carefully to see whether or not there has been any increase. So far, the evidence is very encouraging. The first step in the what we call the events research programme proceeded, and that allowed us to move to relax further, as we did last night. And now we're moving to a third stage. So we are steadily lifting restrictions as and when we are advised it is safe to do so.
60,000 people can attend the semi-finals and the final of the Euros, but my friends can't go to their kids' sports day.
Well, these are one-off events as part of a test programme, and obviously the rules governing attendance at those events are still very strict. You have to demonstrate that you've had double vaccination or that you've had a negative.
Why can't parents do that for
test.
a sports day?
Well, I very much hope that they soon can. I mean,
But there's no point soon can. It's the 23rd of June. Sports days are all coming up in the next few weeks at the end of term. End of term drama productions, graduation ceremonies, school discos. It's all happening in the next few weeks, and we're not talking about restrictions being released until the 19th of July, until basically when schools close. Why are we allowing? Well, I mean, I love football. I'm really delighted the football matches are happening in the UK and that spectators can attend. Why are we not allowing the same freedoms for ordinary families to do really important things with their lives and their children's lives? And we're not, and people singing and dancing at weddings. People are singing and dancing at Wembley. It just, you know as well as I do, this just doesn't smack of things being sensible or things being fair.
I think there is a difference between a one-off event, which can be very carefully controlled, where there can be very strict checks to make sure that people have got the necessary proof of vaccination or negative tests, and so simply relaxing it across the country. I would love us to be able to relax it and for people to attend, parties and to celebrate and to go to the theatre again. And I very much hope that we will be able to do that soon. But I think it was right that we proceed cautiously. Certainly the people I talk to would much rather that the government did adopt a cautious approach and that we do nothing that will put at risk, the huge progress that we've made.